All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. Today we have Nick Farr joining us. Nick is a part of Burners Without Borders and has spent nearly 20 years preparing for and responding to various different disasters. And he wrote this brilliant short piece called The Long Disaster, Resiliency Through a Variety of Effort, which will be the focus of our discussion today. So Nick's actually came on my radar when Jamie Wheel last came to the Stoa. And I asked Jamie, how does one actually wrap their head around being practical in responding to the meta crisis? And he suggested we read Nick's piece and become long disaster responders. So I'm very excited for Nick to be here today. And how it's going to work. If you have questions anytime, if you read the piece already, just pop them in the chat. Nick and I will have a exchange for perhaps 10, 15 minutes about the piece, and then we'll pivot to Q&A. We're here for about an hour in total. So that being said, welcome to the Stoa, Nick.
Oh, thank you so much. It's awesome to be here. Thank you for having me. Love talking about this, love interacting. And one of the things I absolutely love is hearing what other people's responses are to the essay or thoughts that come up as we're discussing it. So I'm looking forward to hearing your comments.
Cool. So if you have any questions or comments, just pop in the chat, and then I'll call and you can ask it or share it with Nick. And for those who haven't read the piece or just watching this for the first time on YouTube, perhaps we can begin with what is the long disaster?
In a brief, and I'm going to preface this real quickly by saying that as of the time of this recording, the longdisaster.org is down. I'm still working on finishing that. I'm just coming back from spending about a month out in northern Nevada building off-grid electric vehicle charging stations to help fill in a lot of that void, get to renewables much more quickly, and figure out a way that anybody can implement an off-grid electric vehicle charging / power station for their community, wherever they happen to be throughout the world. So in the time my website's down, I haven't had time to focus on that, but hopefully by the time the YouTube recording comes out, the longdisaster.org will be back up and you can read the essay. But in the meantime, I posted a link to the essay as it was originally released by Burners Without Borders right there in the chat. In a phrase or two, the long disaster is two key points. One, what we saw with COVID, what we're seeing with wildfires, what we're seeing over the past decade is that disasters like earthquakes, pandemics, wildfires that we thought were discrete events limited to a place and a time are no longer discrete, that they exist on a continuum, that if they have not already affected everybody on the planet, will affect everybody on the planet. And for most of the planet, they've been living in it for most of their lifetime, this continuum of disaster. Our ability to respond to these disasters, more in the Western world. In the Western world, we're more accustomed to thinking about responding to disaster. When earthquake happens or the mass shooting happens or something happens and we send in first responders to respond to it and stop the bleeding and then eventually fix and ameliorate everything. That capacity for response can't keep up with this continuum of disaster. And so the conceit behind the long disaster and what most of the essay talks about is saying that if we are to survive past these things, we as communities need to start banding together and coming together in more tranquil times, creating art, creating beauty, meeting our neighbors, planning things, working together as communities, which most of the world already does to a very large degree, so that when disaster does strike, we know our neighbors, we know what our capacities are, we know how to work together, and we know how to respond as communities to get ourselves out of whatever the long disaster is bringing us that particular day, and thrive and move on as a community. And most of what was in the long disaster, in addition to all that thesis, were some gaps that I see in a lot of organizing from that Western world perspective that as communities we should look at, focus on, and address.
Perhaps we can go into the six gaps that you mentioned: the psychological gap, the skills gap, the resource gap, communications gap, community gap, and empathy gap. Um, should we like knock them down one by one?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in brief, I mean, I do talk about them in the essay, but essentially where these gaps came from were from my 20 years of community organizing, starting off with hacker spaces. Some of you might remember NYC Resistor, Noise Bridge in San Francisco, a lot of these other things circa, you know, early aughts, actually I should say mid aughts. We started organizing what were basically artist studios for the technologically inclined. And then that's since moved on. I've organized things such as food co-ops, Burning Man art projects, mutual aid networks, different things like that. And a lot of, whether we're talking about spaces that are very technically focused, we have, you know, sort of the super genius coder nerds, through artists or people who are just trying to cure a food desert. I see a lot of these same kind of gaps affecting all of these different efforts to organize in a common goal at the community level. Uh, Entities where you don't have the traditional extractive model of a boss who has a lot of capital and then hires managers to manage a bunch of people in a strict hierarchy like that. Community-based efforts are a bunch of people who are essentially peers coming together, deputizing each other, figuring out how to make this thing work. And in modern Western societies, we don't have that intrinsic programming of being able to organize ourselves in those kinds of ways. We're much more accustomed to that chain of command. Tell me what to do and what my part is and how I'm a cog in this machine. So just to sort of bang them out, the psychological gap is more about disaster responders and responder trauma. And I think in a lot of ways you could extend that into saying the trauma of living in a command and control hierarchy. You don't know how to organize with other people that you're around, and acquiring that skill as an adult or as a, you know, outside of your childhood. As a child, you're programmed how to follow command and control structures. The teacher is right, don't talk back, do all these other things. You're programmed how to do that. You're not programmed how to collaborate with your fellows and create and move towards a thing or decide what you want to move towards. And so the psychological gap addresses in the essay. It mostly talks about how responders, whether they're, you know, traveling all around the world and responding to disasters, or ambulance drivers in your town, the continuum of this long disaster is obvious to anybody in that first responder role, that it's just too much too quickly. There's this emotional labor that we don't talk about. I mean, and now granted, we're starting to talk about it. We're talking about it a lot more than we did before the pandemic, which is an amazing thing. But that's really what the psychological gap is talking about. The skills gap kind of is also another facet of that Western society where we're taught from an early age to specialize in a thing. You know, generalists are bad. You have to do that thing and be that one and channelize yourself into a way. And we don't really have, while those opportunities may exist, they're not omnipresent. Those opportunities to collect skills or to learn about your other aptitudes. This is what makes Burning Man as a festival such a great thing, because it gives people the opportunity to acquire new skills, not just for the sake of acquiring those new skills, but because it's a part of their survival context in that thing. This is why art projects are amazing, because people have the room to experiment with and fail. And that's how you learn. You don't learn by succeeding, you learn by failing. And we have fewer and fewer and fewer spaces where it is safe to fail, where failure is encouraged. I know in the startup world, we talk about, oh, fail quick and fail, all this other stuff like that. But when we're talking about hammering a nail into a piece of wood, Nobody comes out of the gate hammering nails in perfectly every single time. Every framer out there has probably bent thousands of nails before they got to the point where they could just boom, 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 knock it out. That's kind of what the skills gap talks about. The resource gap, communities are constantly, and in some ways, the design of our capital structures in modern Western society make it so that community-based efforts are not very well resourced, both in terms of just raw financials, but also in terms of having the right tools to meet the needs. Communities may not know exactly what tools they need to meet those resources things. We have in Oakland and in Toronto and in some other places, we have tool libraries. Great, the resources are there, but who's there to show you how to use them? Who's there to uh, say that you don't need all of these three tools? A lot of community efforts and hackerspaces spend a lot of money buying a lot of tools that they never use because they're just buying it off a list that somebody else told them to buy. And so now you can kind of see how all of these things kind of weave together. The communications gap is that kind of talks in two different ways. One, it says that a lot of the ways that we communicate as communities now through Facebook, through Instagram, through Twitter, through all of these wonderful global worldwide organizing tools are controlled by corporations who have rules, who can cut your access off to those things at any time, who when the wheels start falling off of Western civilization, hopefully that never happens, but it's probably, looking at all the evidence, something that's very likely to happen within most of our lifetimes. Those social networks, the internet, those are going to be one of the first things that fails. And then what? What the communications gap starts to address is saying, as communities, you should look for ways of communicating that are much more resilient than the Facebooks, Twitters, Instagrams, Telegrams, whatever it is of the world. Start looking to things, old school technologies like ham radio. In the event of a disaster, can you communicate when there is no power, when there is no internet? Is that something that your community needs to do? Maybe, maybe not, but it's something that you should start thinking about. The community gap is exactly sort of what I've been talking about all along. We don't intrinsically know how to form communities in modern Western cisgendered white society. You remove some of those qualifiers and people get a little bit better at forming communities. That traditionally disadvantaged classes are actually much better at forming communities because that's a part of their survival strategy. One of the things about modern Western whiteness, not to get too far into the weeds on that, but it is that sort of, you have your job and make your paycheck and have your apartment and do your thing, and you are your specialist, isolated kind of person. And just that ability to acknowledge that we don't know how to form community. It's when we traditionally form communities, usually there's this one charismatic founder person who attracts a whole bunch of people to them, and then a community forms around that charismatic leader. And then when the charismatic leader turns out to be problematic, or when it's clear that the leader's vision is different from what the group wants to do as a group, that you start having problems. It's the founder's curse. We're talking about startup language. That inherent ability for people to recognize what they bring to a community, to recognize what their skills are, how to communicate those skills out to everybody else, and then come together where everybody is not just serving the group with the skills that they have, but serving the group in the way that my colleague from Burners Without Borders, Krista Breedlove, says so beautifully, that serves in the way that feeds them the most. That if in the process of service, you aren't yourself being enriched and nourished and replenished, that's not sustainable. And just the tacit acknowledgement that that is hard and that we don't know how to do it. It's like learning how to ride a bike. We rarely, in this fake it till you make it, go, go, go kind of world, give ourselves the opportunity and the chance to say, we don't know how to do this. That's incredibly vulnerable. We're not great at being vulnerable, and we're with our partners or with people that we're supposed to be very vulnerable with. And we're definitely not comfortable being vulnerable around a group of people that we barely know, who we all have to trust are in it together for the same sort of thing. And that leads into the empathy gap, that really being empathetic is already hard enough to do. But being empathetic at that group level, where it's hard to be vulnerable, where it's hard to really read into people, where you may not be acquainted with the communication styles of all of those others and how those others communicate within the group, on top of the fact that, it's hard for us to understand what first responders and people who work in all of these disasters are going through. It's hard for us to understand, the latent background traumas that a lot of people have, and recognizing that people bring not just their skills and their passions to a group effort, but they also bring their traumas. They also bring their pain. They also bring vulnerable parts of themselves, and they're looking for healing from that community. And on top of actually doing the thing that your community is coming together to do, in that community building process, people are looking for healing, whether they recognize it or not. And is your community a healing one, or is it an extractive one? And that sort of touches on all of those 6 gaps as I identified it, and a lot of the different things that come about in community organizing. I kind of throw into one of those things, and the idea for calling them what they are is their words. I talk about, I dedicate a couple paragraphs to each one, but as you think about it, think about what is the skills gap in your group? What's the psychological gap? What's the resource gap? Even though I say one thing for your group, it may be something entirely different. And that's why I think it's a great trainer of food of thought as you go and contemplate assembling your own communities that exist and communities that you want to exist, and kind of have a very light touch framework for addressing those things that you might not look at or address otherwise.
Yeah, it's a really, really awesome survey of the gaps. And to double click on the skills gap for a moment, for people just starting out, do you have like a starter checklist you would recommend, especially for people who are situated in the city, like do homestays, join hacker spaces, get licensed as an amateur radio operator, things like that?
Yeah, I have a whole bunch of things in the essay that address each. That's 1 or 2 suggestions for how you can address that gap in your group, or 1 or 2 examples of how other groups have done it. But one of the things about being a long disaster responder is I encourage people to not follow a pre-prescribed formula for anything. What I really encourage, and what I think the long disaster responder, if we're going to call them that, and that's just my name for it, is to really look deeply first in yourself, and then in your groups or the neighbors or the people that are close to and around you, and figure those things out, and just think about it. Run a thought exercise, gather your neighbors together around your garden or in the park, or if if you have kids and their parents that you always meet at the playground at a certain time, and you're just kind of getting to know them, start talking about, hey, what would happen if X thing happened? How would we be prepared? What are you, and really start with conversation, get vulnerable, and then think about what the needs are that you think are the first to go. And that's when you start addressing what kinds of skills you should get, or where you should go, or things that you can look at. I think a lot of us are expecting that checklist. And the long disaster responders' first thought should be, well, you know what? The checklist is a great resource. I'm going to integrate that into my deeper thinking about all of these things, but I'm not just going to go rush out to the hardware store and buy the stuff that's on the checklist. Before I buy or acquire any new resource, I'm going to think, do I have the skills to use this? Is this going to be helpful? Am I going to be able to train my neighbors in how to do this thing, or use this thing? And is this thing really going to be helpful in the way that I can bring my talents to bear on helping my communities come together, whether that's through art or through common projects or through a food cooperative or through whatever it is, that will then build the capacity to respond to whenever the long disaster rolls through our neighborhood.
So this might be my last question. So if anyone has any questions, pop them in the chat or shares, and I'll call on you. Ask it to Nick. There's a quote that I really like that you had, that I'm pulling from your piece, and I'll read it. Just as artists seek out a variety of different materials, experiences, and influences to inform their work, long disaster responders should engage in creative approaches that cross disciplines to bridge these practical gaps we have observed in our own responses to various crises. And I found this framing of preparing for disaster as an artwork quite like inspiring, and making what is a very heavy aspect of reality more exciting and beautiful. So I was hoping if you could speak more on how preparing for disaster or collapse could be an artistic endeavor.
It's not so much preparing for disaster as artistic pursuit, but really pursuing art. And I think another unfortunate, I hate to keep trashing Western society, but the capacity and the desire to build and create art and expression, I believe, exists in all of us. Unfortunately, that inherent capacity, that childlike wonder, that childlike need to express ourselves, I think, is muted as we take on other skills. As we, like, personally, I'm an accountant. I even bristle when, I have created art. I love creating art. I love writing. I love sculpture. I love doing all of these things. But even there's a part of me that says, "Oh, Nick, you're obviously an artist." I say, "No, I'm not. I'm not an artist." There's a part of me that sort of closes down when somebody describes me as an artist, and that's something that I wonder where that self-censorship comes from. And I think that self-censorship is in a lot of us. Everybody has the capacity to create art. And I think one, tapping into that inner resource that we all have for expression, for creativity, regardless of who we are, whether we're accountants or actuaries or what. I'm just thinking of things that are not traditionally considered creative pursuits. Just the process of tapping into that in ourselves is very analogous to the process that happens when people are struck by disaster and they have to come up with creative solutions. All they have is the wreckage around them that they need to make do with. Those two processes, the processes of the inner exploration of who you are as a creative, as an artist, and how you make do with what is left, are two very similar processes. And if you get the practice of exploring what your inner artist is, and then sort of bringing that inner artist out slowly, whether that's writing poetry, whether that's just drawing something, even if it's bad, make good art, make bad art, make any art. Art is art. It's your expression. It's how you resonate with people. And that practice of finding your inner artist in and of itself is an amazing way to prepare for the long disaster. And then when you take it to the next level, when you start working on an art project, and one of the reasons I love Burning Man, for two reasons, Burning Man does this on two levels. And Burners Without Borders, as a sort of extension of the Burning Man movement, is it encourages people to come together to make art and then burn it. Realizing that everything that we create on this planet exists for a moment in time. That moment could be 3 seconds, it could be 3,000 years. But either way, when we look at the total arc of time in this reality, they're both just moments, no matter what. Everything is ethereal. And I think creating art for Burning Man is a tacit acknowledgement of the fact that human expression is ethereal. And And Burning Man is also when people go to Black Rock City, where there is no infrastructure, where it is one of the harshest places on earth to exist. People are practicing for the apocalypse. People are bringing all of their own infrastructure. They're realizing, they're consciously recognizing that the resources that we have in our world are not infinite, that people who were born and raised and grow up and die where the tap always delivers water, where the light switch always comes on, there's always electricity, there's always gas. Whether or not we realize it, people who live in areas where infrastructure has always worked are conditioned to think that these resources are infinite and limitless, because in their experience, they always have been. And one of the beautiful things about people when they go out to Black Rock Cities, they realize, oh no, these are very finite resources. These take a lot of energy to bring out and to manage and to run and to go about. And so the process of creating art projects with others, even if you're just following another artist's vision, every screw that you put into something, every bit of work that you do, even on somebody else's art project, even if it was pre-prescribed, is your artistic expression. And it's helping you discover your own artistic expression. And one of the beautiful things about Burning Man as an art creation community and permission engine is that people who work on other people's art projects then go on to create their own. And then they build more communities out of that. And then when you're actually in there working with others on a common goal, you learn how to communicate, you learn how to argue, you learn that back and forth that happens, that is not always pleasant, and most of the time is not. Building something on that compressed time scale, when you're in it, is often a very stressful experience. It's a stressful experience for the crew, for the artists. Things happen, but in that stressful process, you become much closer as a community. You learn how you work with others. You learn much more about how you work and yourself. You discover your own inner resources, your own inner limits, and you learn lessons that hopefully you will take to your next community endeavor. And so in that creation of art and beauty or community service, creating a garden, gardening in and of itself, anybody who's an avid gardener knows that it's much more an art than it is a science. You know, you may have a lot of, there's a lot of craft in it, there's a lot of predictability in it, but not everything that you plant will sprout, and not everything that you sprout will grow, and not everything that grows will leap. Hopefully you get better in time and you get to those places, but you get better and better at it, just like you get better at painting or sculpture or anything else. But the process of creating beauty and art and expression is how you learn how to respond to a disaster, both finding and tuning into your own inner resources and in how you work with others. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I love it. Creating communal art helps responding to disaster. It's beautiful. So let's pivot to the Q&A. We have a few questions in the chat. Lisa Norton, you had a question.
Yes, thanks. Hi, Nick. Thanks so much. You were starting, I think, to kind of segue into my question, which was just, I'd love to hear you expand a bit more about how those times of celebration and crisis have, in your own experience, catalyzed new ways of being that you spoke of in the article. Maybe just an example or two, or why is it that we can pull together and unify in the manner of, a visit from an alien invasion? Why is it that the big other of crisis unifies us so effectively? Thank you.
Oh no, you're most welcome. Thank you so much for your question, Lisa. I think the example, the thing that I always keep coming back to is the 2017 Mexico City earthquake. I was living in Mexico City at the time that the earthquake happened, and there was this 6-story pancake office building collapse that was 3 blocks from my apartment. Alvaro Obregón 286. The funny part about that experience, it taught me a lot about how a fundamentally different culture responds to disaster. I think it informed a lot of the things that are in the essay. In Mexico, as opposed to sort of the United States or Canada or Western Europe, people don't rely on the government to show up. That's not a fundamental facet of the Mexican internal myth. I mean, the government is functional, but people don't expect it to be. And in a lot of areas, it's not very functional. But people don't expect the government to be functional. When a disaster strikes, they immediately rush in as a community. They line up. They bring buckets. The topos, or the volunteer crews that are, experienced in this and have been trained for this for many years, show up and start coordinating a mass effort in a way that is really remarkable in the scale of how people coordinate. The fact that I saw it firsthand, and was able to participate in it firsthand as a volunteer. The first night of the earthquake, I just went in, I lined up with everybody else, because that's what you do. You go to the first place that is affected, and you just line up and you wait for them to call upon you as a volunteer. Eventually, because of resources that Burners Without Borders provided, and because of my American privilege, because of the fact that I speak Spanish relatively well, because of my experience in community organizing, at some point I became the volunteer coordinator in that. And the two really big things that it sort of put a big spotlight on things I already kind of knew. There's lots of things that we know already, but we sometimes have to have people really just shine a light on what we already know. The two things that experience really catalyzed in me were, one, we can't rely on the government anymore. Not because there's something inherently bad about the government or because people in the government aren't trying, but because it's just way too much to respond to. What's coming down, it's not something that we can continue to expect the government to reply to. I mean, even FEMA has made in the United States has made the tacit admission that we are not disaster 911. We'll show up when we can get there, but we might not get there right away. I think people who have lived in the far reaches of Canada have already known this for a while. If you're talking about, the Inuit territories or Alaska, the US, or that they already know. It's like, okay, the government will show up here in the spring, we'll take care of it then. They already know about that. But when we're living in cities, when we expect that, response in 3 minutes after we pick up the phone and dial 911, in a sufficiently large thing that happens, we can't expect that response. We have to be ready to do what we can among ourselves in our own communities. That's the first thing that it taught me. And as the volunteer coordinator on that site, I was working at all levels. I was working with the Mexican Army, with the Mexican Marines, with the rescue squad, and then eventually with Protección Civil. The joke is that there was, I go to sleep one night, and the head of the rescue squad, who had made me a promise, we will recover every last body, comes to find me in our nightly briefing and said, we recovered the last body. That promise to you has been fulfilled. I am certain of it. And I was like very gracious and thankful for it. Then I went to sleep, and I woke up 5 hours later with, one of my volunteers poking me saying, Protección Civil's here. And I'm like, okay, well, what are they doing here? It's like, well, they're looking to take over the site. And I'm like, okay, cool. Well, you know, why are you talking to me? It's like, oh, because Erum left last night and you're the most senior person on site and they're expecting you to orient them to everything. And so I did. The other thing that I didn't think that I could really do was lead as an American with American privilege while honoring it and respecting and acknowledging that privilege and using it to the benefit of those who didn't have privilege, using that privilege to counteract and fight privilege. I often will say that one of the most valuable things I did in that experience was to tell people no, that Erum would hand me a cell phone and they would say, diles no, tell them no. And it would be somebody from the Mexican hierarchy of the vast interconnected web of privilege, trying to get their son, daughter, cousin, nephew, whatever, to have their selfie on what became a very famous site during that earthquake, with the obvious implication that they were, you know, one of the heroes of that site. And well, if they were allowed to, and here's the thing about American privilege in Mexico, a sufficiently privileged person will find a way through their network to your boss, who will tell you to do whatever that privileged person wants. I lived outside of that network of privilege. I could just say, they'd say, who's your boss? And it's like, I'm here working in conjunction with USAID. Well, who's your boss in USAID? I'm a volunteer working here. And at the moment I happen to be the volunteer coordinator. That was a privilege that only really Americans or foreigners have in Mexico. And that I was able to use that to the advantage of those who didn't have that privilege was I think something that really was catalyzed or unlocked with me in that particular experience. And in any big disaster experience like that, there are lessons for everybody, even if they're not as dynamic or complicated as that one. In any art piece or art project, in any time that you lose your temper with somebody, or anytime somebody loses their temper with you, there's a lesson there. There's something to be catalyzed. There's something, it may take you years to find out what that was. There's no there are very few, I should say, instant insights in this game. But there are things to learn if your heart is open to learn it. I hope that sufficiently addresses that question.
Any follow-up share, Lisa?
I would just, thank you, Peter. I would just tack on, I definitely had that experience myself, Nick, in China, where leveraging the privilege of a foreigner is often the only available action, right action.
Thank you, Lisa. Lynn, you had a question.
I really love this essay. I think you discerned, or you like distilled something really important. And yeah, I just think it's just full of wisdom. So thank you. So I'm, maybe because of my experience, I'm always thinking of kind of mainstream civic preparedness, right? And it seems like these communities are, some of them are aware and doing stuff. But I'm wondering if there's kind of a route of creating simulations or experience, like your experience gave you that sight in terms of what needs to be done, the ethos, the practices, the philosophy of it. And I really appreciate your practicality. But most people don't have that experience. And so therefore, it's all some, it's either, as you say, the government, which may not come, or it's so far away and it's just not going to happen. And, so I'm wondering if there's, particularly in sort of the civic sector, the voluntary sector where I am, is there kind of a need then sort of to create, without panic, but to create sort of scenarios for preparedness? Like if, 10 years from now, won't we wish that we had done something like this? So I see in this community and adjacent communities, a lot of a lot of thinking through and, kind of getting psychologically ready and hopefully practically ready. But I do worry about sort of that, just everyday people and like what pathway for them. And is there something that can be done on that stream of preparedness, with community leaders and so forth, and just what you would say about that? Yeah, but I just such appreciation for this article. It's brilliant.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you so much, and you're welcome so much. I thank you so much for your gratitude. To get to your question, the first thing that pops to mind are games, tabletop games. There are many different kinds of, and I'm not talking about tabletop scenarios, which are much more common in civic planning and disaster planning. I'm talking about things. There's one really good game by the Tunnel Monster Collective, and again, this is related to Burning Man. It's a game that comes out of the Land Art Generator Initiative project at Fly Ranch, which is a 3,800 acre property that the Burning Man project bought, and is part land conservation project, part laboratory for an off-grid future. And the Laggy design competition for that year at Fly Ranch, and there have been many different Laggy design competitions, but that one that focused on Fly Ranch in particular spoke to how do we build off-grid food, water, energy, and not only how do we do those projects, but how do we do them with that sense of art, beauty, play, and community. And the winners of that design competition were amazing examples in all of those different fields. Out of that competition came a game called Regenerate by the Tunnel Monster Collective, which I think is a really good practice in that sort of thing. So all of the players in the game are collaborating towards a common goal of building that future. And within that future, so you have a couple of turns and rounds where you're preparing and setting things up, and then you have these disaster cards, because the Fly Ranch, the Wallapai Valley, is an even harsher valley than the Black Rock Desert. Most of my work with Burning Man has been at Fly Ranch in the Wallapai Valley, and on the same day I've had does this audience speak more Celsius or Fahrenheit, if I may ask? A little bit of both. I'm just gonna go Celsius. I've had 36-degree afternoons immediately followed 3 hours later by 10 degrees and 50-mile, okay, and like 100-kilometer-per-hour sideways hail on the same day. Just the gamut of different harshness. It's incredible. Anything that happens out on the Black Rock Desert is much more pronounced in the Wallapai, because it's a much smaller valley that has a much higher mountain ridge on one side. There's a lot of water. There's a lot of beautiful things that are in that valley, but it's a harsh environment. And a lot of the things that are in those cards that come up in that game are things that have happened to people in the process of building there. And you have a lot of different resources in play in the game, and you have to talk with each other as a group and how you respond to that. And I think the process of playing games, and there are many other games like that, where, that are very open-ended, that lean much more towards an infinite game than a finite game condition. The difference between the two being a finite game is where there is a fixed victory condition and you either win or you don't. I'm oversimplifying the concept, but I think it's worth elucidating. An infinite game is where the victory condition is coming up with another game to keep all of the players playing and happy together. And I'd say the fastest way to do that is creating that sort of social environment where you're all gathering at somebody's house around a table with food, with beverages, in community, talking about a lot of different things, working on something that is essentially zero stakes. But in that zero stakes environment, you start to learn how people approach different kinds of scenarios and what talents and thoughts and thought processes emerge from that. And the Regenerate by the Tunnel Monster Collective is just one game that I would recommend for that, because that comes out of my own experiences. There are many, many other tabletop games that are similar in that aspect, where it's a collaborative approach, where the players are not competing with each other, but they're sort of competing against the context of the game. And in any major city, if you find people who are really into board games, they will be able to recommend lots of different scenarios for you. There are also many different online versions of those same kind of tabletop games that you can play together. Even playing a collaborative game of Civilization or Free Civ, you can go as open source as you want with Free Civ, or with, as elaborate and with the cool graphics and everything like that of Civ 6. Even playing those kinds of games together in community collaboratively, and really taking a tiny step back and sharing with people what your thought processes are, sharing people what your 3 or 4 moves ahead role is a great way, I think, to accomplish that goal that you're looking for without expending a lot of resources or going into things.
Any follow-up, Sherilyn?
Yeah, thank you. I think that games, what I like about that, we all like about that, is that it's in a space where people feel co-creative and generative, and I think my quest is to try to take some of that co-creation, generative, and kind of make it more accessible to sort of the groups and people I'm thinking of, since many of them, may not be the ones who would throw themselves into a game. So I'm very thoughtful about that. Maybe just one final comment, and I'd appreciate your thought about it, Nick. It reminds me of, so what I've heard, and I'm thinking about, her name is escaping me for a moment, and I know her so well, but where she's talking about how we need a caring economy, and that the sort of the future will be, the jobs will be, Nora Bateson, of course, we'll be talking about, the sustainability of things and the caring for things. And I really was struck by, your sense that this sort of long disaster is a forcing function for something else more beautiful, right? More caring, more taken care of. And if that sort of piece, that shift in our orientation is something that is explicit in the groups that you work with, or whether it's still trying to respond and so forth. But I mean, is there really a crafting here of a new way of being with each other, do you think?
That is my hope, but at the same time, we're constantly fighting our own programming and our own ways of living. That I think, by virtue of the fact that everybody has a device where we can see and hear each other, we're playing and practicing in what is an unsustainable extractive economy. We're not just extracting things from the earth, which will never be replaced. We're also in a lot of ways extracting from each other things that will not be replaced. That there are very few jobs out there where you give your time in exchange for capital that are truly regenerative. I do hope and hope that many people are in those regenerative, refulfilling jobs, but whether it's emotional labor, physical labor, or just time that goes nowhere, we are more used to being in an extractive economy. And so we don't have the programming or the language or the inherent skill for creating a regenerative economy. And it's not just regenerating the planet, but it's regenerating each other. It's creating in collaborating in joy, in those common rituals. I want to point out Lizelle's comment about ritual. Why are rituals such an important part of the human experience? In a word, because those rituals are regenerative. Otherwise, they wouldn't be a part of our inherent human experience. This extractive humanity has only been around for maybe 300-400 years. From maybe a little bit longer than that, but from the dawn of colonialism, that's when it really starts getting going. When the concept of slavery when it reemerges. And it's funny how every time you have more advanced civilizations and civilization gets more advanced, slavery just kind of pops up out of nowhere. But and throughout humanity, that's one of the, why does that happen? But one of the things about rituals, which are common to every culture, every civilization, what is it about? What is it about ritual? There's a certain unanswerable quality to that. But I think rituals, if anything, if they persist throughout time, are one, collaborative group celebrations of the fact that we are alive on this planet. Whether you're talking about meeting in Göbekli Tepe, whether you're talking about Monte Alban, whether you're talking about Christmas or Easter. There are celebrations of life that bring each other together and are by design very regenerative. And I think one of the beautiful things about the interconnectedness of our cultures is that we are coming together and finding our own rituals and bypassing a lot of the problems. A lot of Christmas, Easter, a lot of these rituals have elements of group control. And one of the beautiful things I find about art and culture and the mixing of all of these things as we come together in these Zoom boxes is that we're creating our own rituals and we're sharing them with our friends, and we're cultivating these things that happen perhaps in parallel with much larger rituals. But ritual, I think, is, just like Lizelle pointed out, is incredibly important. And it is important because it is regenerative. And I think we do have to really take, we really in our communities have to continually ask ourselves, are we serving in the way that feeds us the most? Is what we're doing regenerative? Are we practicing self-care as a group? Because we're programmed to think about the mission and the goal. And are we all getting to the goal? Well, are we giving more of what ourselves than we're replacing in ourselves in pursuit of that goal? Then maybe we should re-examine the goal. And that's a hard question to ask, because we're not used to asking it. We have to be very explicit about it. I'm one of the worst offenders of this, by the way. In any group that I'm in, I am just gung-ho working. I mean, I've even been faulted. I actually don't like to attend events. I don't like parties. I don't like socializing. I like to just constantly be of service. My party is making sure that you have a good party, and I have to stop myself in a lot of ways and see that what I want to do and what the impact it has on the group, and remember, am I being regenerative or am I being extractive of myself in this moment?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Nick.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're approaching the top. Lizelle, would you like to sneak in your question?
Yes, please, especially since it's quite relevant to what you just said. I was just wondering if you have any practical suggestions of where we can find inspiration maybe for creating our own rituals for dealing with disaster. And then especially people who from the frontline people who deal with disaster on a regular basis. Is there an author you know of, or a book, or?
I think that, and I'm scrolling back to, I think Josh mentioned it. Rebecca Solnit in all of this has been, and I mean, if I could just pick one author, far and away, Rebecca Solnit, who, and if I could pick 3 books, one speaking more specifically to your question, A Paradise Built in Hell is an amazing, compelling read. The second book is, I'm going to go back to Men Explain Things to Me, which I think is another, and these are just, if I can only recommend 3 books, it would be Paradise Built in Hell, Men Explain Things to Me, Hope in the Dark. These are all, so Paradise Built in Hell is a longer cohesive work. Men Explain Things to Me and Hope in the Dark are collections of essays of Rebecca Solnit's. And Infinite City. I'm actually, my bookshelf is right behind me. You can't see it, but I'm actually looking at it right now. Infinite City, which is an atlas of San Francisco. That is a beautiful work in and of itself. And I think I've mentioned 4 books and I promised 3, but those are the 4 that I think right now resonate most strongly with me for inspiration. Jamie Wheel's Recapture the Rapture, I think, is another good text and when I say these texts, I mean these as books that are launching off points that will lead you in the direction that I think that you would like to go in, and because all of these works reference many, 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 many other works that as they speak to you, and they all talk about disaster responders and people who are at the peaks of whether it's physical fitness or spiritual fitness or all of these other things like that. All of these books, like I have probably reread Recapture the Rapture 5 or 6 times, and I always find something new in it that I missed. Rebecca Solnit's books, I just read as like a safety blanket, or as like a conversation with a warm friend. I don't know if anybody else has this experience with a book that they keep going back to, and they have just, they couldn't tell you how many times they've reread it. They'll sometimes they'll read the book twice while they're in the middle of another book, because it's just, I just need that comfort food reading. And Rebecca Solnit for me is 100% comfort food reading. And I think those 4 books hopefully will help you find your path and your inspiration in those ways.
So we'll close here. Any parting words you'd like to leave us with, Nick?
Thank you for an amazing conversation. Thank you for your amazing questions. And I look forward to interacting with you all in the future as I'm able. And you'll have my contact information to go along with the recording and right here. Correct, Peter? I can just put it in the notes.
And I'll put that in the video notes.
Yep.
And yeah, I'll make some closing announcements in a moment. But Nick, thank you so much for coming to the Stoa today. Definitely check out his long disaster piece. It actually works for me, the .org thing, so it might be up. Check that out if you can. And relatedly about what was spoken about rituals, we're launching a short series called Ritual Studio with Rebecca Fox, and people are going to come in and then she's going to design. She's a ritual artist. So perhaps we can kind of take some long disaster themes here and create some rituals for that. So you can check that out on thestoa.ca and other events as well. So that being said, Nick, everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today.